about it sort of like an addictive-like food. What's the first rule of thumb for somebody who has a true addiction? You're not around it. And success often comes when people's environmental change. And this is very true of people with substance abuse. It might not even be just not around, the drugs not at the house, but it also could be thinking about your friend circle or even your routine.
Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I am here with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and of course, live better. Thanks so much for tuning into the show this week. How are you, EC?
Wonderful. How are you?
I'm fantastical. We are going to talk about something that I believe we've hinted at before, but I'm excited to dive into a whole episode with it, which is whether sugar and or processed food can be labeled as addictive, and if it's something that we can be addicted to. So that's going to be our main conversation this week. And then we will wrap up with another quick diet review. We're going to be talking about something called the F Factor diet, what it is, why people follow it, and of course, your thoughts on whether it is worth our collective attention. Ready?
Let's do it.
Okay. So sugar addiction or processed food addiction is again, we've mentioned it before, but is this a thing that is this a real thing? Is this something that we really need to be worried about? Or is this something that is yeah, people say that, but they don't really mean it. I'm addicted to donuts, but okay, but you're not really addicted to donuts. You just like them.
Yeah, that's a good question that we're also gonna come back to about how that word is used. I like that. But yeah, is this a real thing? Definitely a question I get a lot. Working with clients, people will often talk about their sweet tooth, their lack of control around sugar, and certainly there's been a lot of media. I know even recently I've reheard it, but there's this kind of notion out there that sugar is more addictive than cocaine, which of course refers to a study in rats, which we always have to make the distinction that those aren't humans. But, there are these notions out there how addictive it is. And we do want to make sure that we're clear on our terms, as we always do, from defining the types of food to defining what addiction means. And I do just want to throw in this caveat, I'm not an addiction expert, so it's my nutritionist understanding of addiction here. But yeah, I think the first thing to understand is when we talk about this food addiction, we're not just talking about sugar. People will often say, again, sugar is more addictive than cocaine or something like that, but no one is sitting down to a bowl of table sugar and a spoon. When we think of what we really crave, it's not I'm going to go pour this bowl of sugar and get started.
Yep. You never catch a loved one in the,
right.
alone in the car eating a bowl full of sugar.
What are you doing? It's not sugar packets that people are carrying around. So that is sort of the first distinction. It's really foods that have sugar in them that seem to be problematic. And so one of the terms that's become quite popular in the literature when we're talking about food addiction is what we call, quote, ultra processed foods. And we've used that term a couple of times. I also have used the word historically just processed. And, this is going to be a little bit of a tangent here. I think there's a little bit of confusion about even what that word process means and the significance of it when it comes to making better and worse choices in one's diet. So process can take on a lot of different meanings. At its most basic form, it just means the food has been changed from its natural state. So years ago, 2007, 2008, I think it was, when I worked on a farm in Montana.
I'm so sad I can never say that sentence.
I know. It is a good memory. When we would harvest the vegetables and then bring them to market, we weren't allowed to do any cutting of the vegetables or even washing really of the vegetables, because that would start to be considered processing and then would require different regulations under the USDA to do that. It would need kind of different permitting. And so you could think of processing could even be something like canning black beans. But when I use the word in social media to be processed, what I'm really talking about is when the nutritional quality of the food has been changed. So washing your salad greens doesn't do much. Canning the black beans doesn't do much in terms of the nutritional quality. And really that's when it becomes significant to me in my mind about the change in definition. Hey, what is the change in the nutritional value? And that's how we want to start thinking about process, not just like, is this different than quote nature? And so we don't want to get too dogmatic about that word process. I do get a lot of questions about that, like, oh, I should avoid X food because it's processed. It's like, no, no, let's understand what the final product is in terms of maybe its calories, in terms of its micronutrients, and also even our behavior around it to then understand if processing really is a good or bad thing. Okay, so when I talk about minimizing that processed food, of course, I'm again not talking about the canned black beans, but instead talking about those products that we really can't make in our own kitchen, the ones that require these manufacturing techniques and different kind of ingredients that we don't really have just in the cupboard. And this is really what they mean with the word ultra processed. The calorically dense stuff, the cookies, the chips, the ice cream. And even when you can make things like chips and ice cream at home, they still don't have that same store-bought quality that we find with the man-made stuff that's really hyper palatable. And so that's kind of the word that I'm going to use in this episode, ultra processed, to refer to those calorically dense things, but understand that there's, process sometimes means it, hyper palatable sometimes means it. There's not necessarily always a consistency in that definition, but that's what we're talking about, the packaged stuff. Okay. So when we now look at these ultra processed foods, like I said, it's not just added sugar that they have, it's also added fat. And there's this really great paper called Is Food Addictive by Gearhart in the show notes. When we look at calorically dense foods as we find them in nature, they don't have this very even combination of carbs and fat. Like when we look at coconut, which is a calorically dense food found in nature, it's all fat. When we look at honey, which relatively speaking to other foods found in nature is a calorically dense food, it's all sugar. Even nuts, which are probably the most addictive out of our quote natural unprocessed foods and have more of a combination, they're still mostly fat. And so it's when you take something like almonds, which are these mostly fat, and then you combine them with the cinnamon sugar or cacao powder or something like that, then they become really highly addictive. And so that's something that we really want to think about understanding with these ultra processed foods. It's not that they are just sugar that we're addicted to. It's really this combination of carbs and fat in the pizza, in the ice cream, where people really have this lack of control. And so to understand that that's really what what we're talking about with these type of addictive like foods.
Got it. Okay. So ultra processed. Can we talk a little bit more about like that's just not a term you're throwing out there. Clearly that's like a that means something. That word those words mean something. And so what's the background of that as a term, as a classification of foods? What does the science say about ultra processed?
Uh, yeah, we actually touched on this a little bit with the Mediterranean diet when, there's all this research that's been done on the Mediterranean diet, but we have to see how each different lab defines the Mediterranean diet. There has to be certain parameters about, okay, this is the Mediterranean diet as we tested it. And then when it goes to be repeated, did that next group use the same classification? And so that's what's so important about definitions, that when we're looking at something like ultra processed, is my lab group understanding ultra processed to be the same thing as your lab group? Otherwise, we can't really compare results. And so that's the beautiful thing about setting these definitions and terms, is they help us start to kind of build this repeatable research across different investigators. And so this term ultra processed was created by a professor out of Brazil in 2009. And it's under this NOVA, NOVA food classification that puts food into four groups. Group one is kind of considered our unprocessed or minimally processed foods. This would be like the fruit and the veggies. This would be the canned black beans, if you would. Group two is foods processed in the kitchen with the aim of extending their shelf life. So I guess you could argue that the canned black beans could go there, but this would be things just like fats, like maybe like butter or some herbs that you've processed. You're going to be able to use them later. In my mind, I still think about that as not processed. Group three, processed foods. These are foods that are combining the food groups of one and two. So maybe bread with jelly or jam. So few ingredients. And then group four is this ultra processed foods and using many ingredients, including all of these food additives that improve the food's palatability and textures, and really processes all these raw ingredients and make them into things that we, again, can't really do in our own kitchen, industrial origin type foods. And so That's really the category that we mean, and it has been started to use more frequently in the literature. In fact, I think we even well, I know we talked about it in that sleep quality episode where we found that when people were eating ultra processed foods, it affected their sleep, and then lack of sleep also triggered people to eat more ultra processed foods. But one of the other really interesting studies that has been done with ultra processed foods was this randomized controlled trial in 2019 by Kevin Hall, a really prolific obesity researcher. Now, it was a smaller study, but it kind of as one of the weaker points of it, one of the stronger points of it was that it was a metabolic ward study, right? So this is when people are in that hospital-like setting. We can control all the things. We know exactly what they're eating and not. And what they did is they allowed people to eat ad libitum, which just means as much as they want. And they did this in 2-week blocks, where in one 2-week block, they could eat as much as they wanted of whole unprocessed foods. And then another 2-week block, they could eat as much as they wanted of these ultra processed foods. And they found that people ate 500 more calories per day when they were eating as much as they want on the ultra processed food diet. And no surprise, they gained weight. And then when they went back to eating the whole unprocessed foods, they were able to take off the weight. And so that was just really interesting from the standpoint of there is something about these foods that is making us consume more than we would, of just free range compared to whole unprocessed foods. And I think that's really important. And when we translate it to what's happening in our modern food environment, these ultra processed foods are literally everywhere, as we've talked about all the time. More than half of the calories that we consume and on any given day is from ultra processed foods. We like the taste of them. They're affordable. They're highly profitable for for their companies that make them. They're really aggressively marketed, and they're literally sold everywhere. And so, no surprise, we are also consuming too many calories of them.
Mm. So what about ultra processed foods makes them so so hard to stop eating, right? I mean, part of it is what you just said, which is the marketing and the financial incentives of putting them everywhere and they're cheap to make, et cetera. But at the end of the day, we've got to keep putting them in our mouths. So so what's going on with that?
Yeah, I mean, even if bananas were aggressively marketed, there's still like people will just stop eating them at a certain point, right?
Not
There's
me though.
certainly something
Not me.
I know, not you, right? Or not me either, right? Yeah, there's certainly something about these foods physiologically that is addictive like. And so this is that book that I've recommended, one of the few books I recommend, The Hungry Brain by Stephen Guyenet. It's so good because it talks about why we're really driven and wired to eat these processed foods, why we crave it. The simple explanation for now is that just the dopamine response we get from them. So dopamine, I think, sometimes is thought of as okay, that's what makes us happy, or it's kind of associated with pleasure. But what I really liked about how Guillenet explained it is it's more accurate to think about it as the reinforcement signal. It tells us, hey, whatever you just did, go do it again. And we're going to motivate you to keep doing that behavior. And it appears that that dopamine release from ultra processed foods is quite high, higher than just eating sugar, let's say honey, higher than just eating fat, let's say coconut, higher than eating whole unprocessed foods, let's say, the lean chicken breast. And it would make sense from an evolution standpoint of why we are supposed to reinforce that behavior because food was scarce at a certain point. Like we didn't have food everywhere and anywhere. And so when we came across an item that gave us so many calories and was so calorically dense in a short little or in a small little packet, hey, we want to be motivated, find that food again because that's going to keep us alive. And so it really was a beautiful mechanism in the sense of helping human survival and how to seek out food that is really going to give us the calories that we need. So it was a good thing. Was is the key word. Because now with this stuff all around us all the time, we need to stop eating it, but our wiring is just still the same. We are wired to continue to seek out these calories. And what's also really interesting, I think, about this wiring is there's lots of other factors besides the calories that come into play that there's lots of environmental cues, memories, sights, sounds, locations that feeds into our wanting of that dopamine response. I think birthday cake is a great example. I mean, most of the time birthday cake is associated with a host of other memories, a host of other good memories. And so it's not just how delicious it is with the carbs and the fat, it's also that it has these good feelings that further heighten our wanting or need for it, mental
Okay.
need for it.
Right. right, emotional need for it.
Right.
Okay, back to the question then that we started this with, which is it an addiction? Is that the right word for, given everything you just said, is that the right word for it? Or are we again hijacking something that does mean something? There's a meaning to that word addiction and misapplying it.
Yeah. Yeah, the jury's still out as far as I understand of whether or not this is a true addiction. And part of the problem is literally coming up with the standards to be able to diagnose it. Like any other mental health disorder, assuming this is sort of an addiction, it doesn't have a single biomarker to diagnose it. You can diagnose diabetes by looking at blood sugar, right? You can look at different markers for heart disease or cancer and know that, okay, this person has this disease. It's not the same with mental health conditions, and therefore it's harder to define it. And for me, when I first heard the idea of is food addiction, it was definitely a harder concept for me to wrap my mind around. I think I have always thought about addiction as something that comes with that euphoric or kind of mind altering experience, right? Kind of and a deviation from what you would consider kind of normal social behavior. But as that Gearhart paper points out, tobacco is a great example of an addictive substance, but people can use it and still go about their day and have no alteration in their cognitive experience, right? Which, of course, is not the same with hard drugs or alcohol. But that really kind of made me rethink this a little bit. That, okay, addiction doesn't necessarily mean like euphoria or mind altering experience. Um, One of the strong parallels to substance abuse is the continued behavior of this, food consumption, all while knowing it's not good for you and it's not necessary for survival, which is really a like kind of other addictive substances, right? We don't need alcohol, and people can continue to consume it knowing it's bad for them, and so that's where it really kind of mirrors that. One of the issues, though, on the other side, why maybe less so of an addictive like behavior, is whether or not there's a true withdrawal from ultra processed foods. So the research is pretty scant on whether or not people experience withdrawal from these foods, and it typically is just kind of an anecdotal response that people, become more anxious or irritable or something, or headache or fatigue, kind of these 2 to 5 days out about cutting out of these foods. But interestingly enough, even there, from what I understand, drugs have a range of responses with withdrawal. Some require medical treatment when you're going through withdrawal, and others really don't need to because it's not as severe. So, whether or not that needs to be the defining characteristic of whether or not this is a true addiction, I think is still kind of up in the air. The other thing is some of the debate about whether or not this is a true addiction is, what are we addicted to? I kind of mentioned, we're not sitting down to a bowl of sugar. So, how do you define addiction if we can't even define what the addictive substance is? In alcohol, it's the ethanol, and cigarettes, it's the nicotine. But what is it? What do we really like about these ultra processed foods? I think what's interesting though is nobody sits down and drinks pure ethanol, and nobody even smokes pure nicotine. They also are processed in a way to make them more addictive. And so they have a central component to them that makes them addictive, but yet they have some processing that even heightens that experience. And so for processed food, we really haven't been able to do the same thing. We haven't been able to say, oh, it's the sugar, then the fat and the additives heighten experience. I think that's probably kind of the leading hypothesis right now. But again, some of this debate is, what are we addicted to? Because we also see that people have different trigger foods. Some people will have that kind of lack of control of response around ice cream, others have it around pizza. And so it becomes really a gray area of figuring out, again, what is the substance that we are addicted to. And finally, another thing to throw in this conversation about understanding of whether or not this is a true addiction is the type of addiction it may be. So some argue that it's more of a substance abuse addiction, and then others say it may be a behavior addiction. And a behavior addiction would be something like gambling. You're addicted to the feeling of acting out that behavior. Where substance abuse, of course, that's a specific substance. Again, I'm not the expert here in addiction. To me, it probably aligns a little bit more with a substance abuse. Because in my mind, if you were addicted to the behavior of eating, you'd be addicted to the behavior of eating carrots, right? You'd be addicted to the behavior of like just eating way too much cauliflower. And we just don't see that, right? Like haven't really found the person who's overeating cauliflower. Maybe they're out there, but it seems to be really around these ultra processed foods. So that was a lot of kind of back and forth of strengths and weaknesses, pro and against kind of this as an addiction. I think the debate will go on for a little bit of time. I think we can comfortably say there is an addictive like behavior around ultra processed foods.
What would you say categorizes or indicates whether somebody has this addictive like behavior? Like, what does that look like? Again, because it's one of those things that like I'm addicted to whatever, fill in the blank, right? We throw these words out there, and they what does it actually? What in your mind? What does that actually look like to have an addictive like behavior around ultra processed foods?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And that Gearhart paper actually goes into that idea of how we throw around these words so casually. I mean, even shopaholic is is a good example of how addiction just becomes part of our conversation. Um, and so I think sometimes too, people will self identify as having a problem that maybe doesn't necessarily also translate to a clinically relevant issue. Kind of like you said in the beginning, like, I really like donuts. Okay. But is that actually changing your life in a negative way? Maybe you think it is, but you're just enjoying donuts on Sunday morning with your family. Like, okay, right? So there is not an agreement of whether or not it's an addiction. So there isn't really a way to diagnose it. The American Psychological Association puts out this diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, which is often abbreviated as DSM. And there's 11 diagnostic criteria for substance abuse classification. And again, food addiction isn't there, but when we're looking at something like a substance abuse, they start to look at factors like, okay, are social and occupational and recreational activities given up or reduced because of your use from this substance, right? Or do you fail to fulfill certain obligations because you're using this substance? And in that context, when you have met two or more of the criteria, you have a disorder where, of course, the more you meet, the more severe it is. Six or more of these different criteria, and you have a severe disorder. So we would think that assuming, food has becomes classified as an addiction, it would look something like this. And so we don't have that exactly, but in the meantime, this author of this paper I keep referencing in 2009, she developed the Yale Food Addiction Scale, or the YFAS, during her PhD research. And it's basically a way for people to identify, hey, do I really have this dependency on these foods? And since she's originally authored it, it now has 13 questions, and it's based on the criteria that I just mentioned. It's been through lots of different tests at this point. Different research has used it, which is great to say, okay, yes, we're getting kind of consistent results across different populations. And so this would be kind of the closest tool to evaluate if and how much the addictive like behavior is impacting your life, I think, at this point. Um, again, I think there's people are quite quick to say I'm quote addicted to something without realizing, oh, I just consume too many chips when I open the bag, but it's not really interfering with my life in a meaningful way. And you like to point out this statistic I saw in the paper was really interesting. 90% of adults consume alcohol at some point over their lifetime, but it's only 14 of which that develop an actual alcohol use disorder. So there's going to be many, many people who eat ultra processed foods, but don't really develop this to a true disorder because of that consumption. What the prevalence of food addiction or a food addictive like behavior may be, it's estimated to be upwards of 20% of the population. This is according to the Vasilou paper in the show notes. But I think what's interesting there is that statistic of how common it might be is actually a little bit higher than alcohol uses I just kind of quoted. And I think that reflects because it's so prominent everywhere we go. That because our environment has made this so socially acceptable and it's around us at every turn and, we can't almost get away from it, that I would expect its prevalence to be higher at this stage just because our environment is so much a part of that problem. But yeah, I mean, I think, if somebody has a real concern about it, it would be working with a mental health practitioner to see where they are on this kind of scale and how much it's really interfering with their life versus, oh, I like donuts on Sunday morning.
Right, right, right. So leading into the next question, which is what do we do with it? Like if it's either me as an individual, if I feel like I am exhibiting some of these behavior, like or this addictive like behaviors, or just broader. Like I always like to ask you, what the heck should we do collectively as a society? So like on an individual basis and a societal basis, like what is the solution here in your mind?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think just to rehammer what I last said, if somebody really thinks they have an issue, they need to work with a mental health practitioner, right? Even if you do have this addictive like food behavior, there is no quick diet tip to fix it. I mean, this is going to be maybe cognitive behavioral therapy techniques or whatever other therapies to help you kind of deal with the root of the issue and why we're using food to manage that issue. But I do think that aside, and then talking to individuals where there's going to be less severe cases where people are just consuming this to varying degrees, what do we need to do? Good old fashioned habit change, which we've talked a little bit about before, right? And this is where that broken record is going to come in. But your environment is what you can control. Without some major policy intervention, the greater food environment's not changing anytime soon. And so what can we control? Our home environment. And so I do think though it can be useful to sort of make that switch in your mind of, okay, think about it sort of like an addictive like food. What's the first rule of thumb for somebody who has a true addiction? You're not around it. And success often comes when people's environmental change, and this is very true of people with substance abuse. It might not even be just not around the drug's not at the house, but it also could be thinking about your friend circle or even your routine. And that might sound a little bit severe for something like ultra processed food, but it's good to think about it. Okay, what are my triggers surrounding this? Is it always when I go out to happy hour with X, Y, and Z person, it just completely becomes a weekend fiasco? Okay, maybe that's kind of the situation that you want to take out of your quote environment so that you can start to make some real habit change. Um, I do think what's really interesting about this is that if ultra processed food, or if they are able to officially diagnose it and say, okay, this is an addiction, that will have very big ramifications in terms of legislation. And so, that is where we actually might start to get to some control of our greater food environment, not just what's happening in your house, but what's happening at every store, everywhere, right? Because once we say, okay, there is addiction here and this is driving a health problem, it's going to be much like tobacco, in my opinion, making it much more difficult to get. And yeah, there's some economical ramifications we'd probably want to think through, but I'm really all for it. And, I think things even so basic as, hey, we're not going to put it in our schools. We're going to change checkout lines so it's not all littered with snacks. I'm a big proponent of this. I know we've touched on it before, but hey, if your store doesn't make X% of its revenue from food, you're not selling any of this stuff, right? Why does my electronics store have candy bars at it? I have no idea, except that it sells, right? So I think changes like that, I'm certainly not for it all has to go away forever, but it's changing the food environment that it's less accessible, it's less easy to get. And I think that's much stronger than something like a soda tax, because I just think a soda tax per individual item doesn't have enough of a hit or a punishment, if you will, to prevent people from doing it. It's only a few cents. Where something like the environment of making it much harder to get definitely would have a bigger effect. But until that happens, I think there's a little bit of, hey, it's just about understanding yourself and kind of calling out yourself. What does my environment look like? Have I set up myself up for success? And what are my triggers? What are the foods that really spin me out? Or what are the friend groups that really spin me out? And trying to make changes there.
I think I've only got one follow up on that last, or the sort of the societal thing, which is, so part of that happening would be contingent on the understanding that this addiction, to your point, which we talked about, which is like this addiction, quote unquote, first, it's an addiction, but it's one that leads to negative effects down the line, right? Same thing with which cigarettes happen because they were able to connect cigarettes and, in that case, lung cancer, right? And so I present all that just to ask, like, is the research clear enough yet that ultra processed food leads to fill in the blank heart disease, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, such that they can then reverse engineer that and say, in order to stop that, we have to deal with this addiction. And in order to do that, we have to do the things you just laid out. Because that's, I think, the only way it would ever happen is that it would have to be clearly linked to this negative uh, effect, such that they would have the kind of the teeth to make those regulations. Are we there yet?
I think the first place that we would be there with is with obesity. Certainly I do think that these play into stuff like cardiovascular disease and cancer, and definitely there have been conclusions that more diseases would be prevented. But I think obesity is going to be the clearest link. And studies like that Kevin Hall study is going to be super valuable. And then to be able to repeat that and make that larger, to be like, hey, when we give people free access to this stuff, they consume more and they gain weight. And, I don't think one study is going to do it. I don't know how many more studies have been done quite like that: metabolic ward, ultra processed food versus whole unprocessed food. But I think linking that to obesity, which has its own health costs and has its own health risks, aside from the fact that other comorbidities tend to come with it, I think that evidence is there and definitely can be, though, furthered to be able to then really kind of make this claim that it is directly linked to a negative health outcome. Yeah. Before we head into the next part of the show, here's your reminder to register for my January group of my 3 Pillars Method Masterclass at optimizemenutrition.com/masterclass, and the link is in the show notes. This masterclass is where you're going to figure out your caloric targets personalized for your genetics and your body composition or fitness goals. You will develop a sustainable plan that allows you also to live your life and eat out with your family. Here's Wileen from this year.
I learned what my true base was for maintenance, which was way higher than I've ever had before. So when I initiated the first small cut that I've done, it's been very sustainable and I'm not feeling hungry or fatigued like I was with those other programs. EC was pretty clear that sustainability is the most important thing, and perfectionism kills everything. You can have the pizza with your family and you can still see results. I did want to lose a little bit of weight and I have lost 5 pounds, but I've gained so much more because my performance in my CrossFit workouts, my running has increased so much over the last couple months. It's really kind of mind blowing. I wasn't expecting that.
Going through the masterclass is how you are going to develop your science-backed, sustainable, forever nutrition plan. And it's where you're going to be able to ask questions in our live group coaching format along the way so that you get support and guidance from me, which is not possible in a podcast format. Here's Courtney from this year.
Since my first week or two in, I said, this is sustainable. I do think it's something that doesn't have you handcuffed to a food scale for the rest of your life, right? And you get to understand for yourself why your numbers are where they are and how they kind of play and come together, but also how you can flex it and make it work for you. You don't have to fit in this specific box every single day. The other pieces is the access to EC is really phenomenal. So every single post throughout the class, she's responding to everything, and it's not superficial. She's really thinking about what are we experiencing and just providing great responses as well as encouragement, which I think is also something that I was looking for that I wasn't getting before.
So head on over to optimizemenutrition.com/masterclass to register. And calling all nutrition coaches or those who want to become a 3 Pillars Method coach and teach people nutrition like I do. The coaches version is also kicking off in January, and you can go to optimizemenutrition.com/masterclass coaches, one word. CEUs are also available for CrossFit, NASM, AFA, ACE, ACSM, and NSCA. And the link is also in the show notes. Registration for both closes January 2nd. Okay, let's get back to the show.
Okay. Diet review, F factor. First question. What the heck is F factor?
Caveat first. I didn't read a book for this one. I didn't do a deep dive on the cited whatever.
Yeah.
I scanned the internet to understand what the F factor diet is. So
that's what most people do. So I would rather your quick scan of the internet than my own on this. So go.
So this is all without kind of knowing every last aspect of it. But yeah, the F factor diet, the F is for fiber, which we had a relatively recent episode on. We learning or talking about all the health benefits of fiber. So far, so good. But Yeah, basically the F factor diet, the focus is on eating 3 fiber-filled meals a day and a snack, loading up on what they call healthy carbs, which of course are gonna be fruits and veggies and whole grains type of stuff, and then not necessarily restricting eating out or even alcohol. Now, the goal with fiber is to get 35 grams of fiber a day, which is interesting, as like a central focus of the diet is fiber, that target is not outlandish. It's not really even that high. So the recommendations are about 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories. And so people eating 2,000 calories a day would be 28 grams of fiber. And then people eating 2,500 calories a day would be 35 grams of fiber. So I just sort of felt that was interesting. I mean, maybe even a plus of this diet, but it wasn't like they said, okay, 100 grams of fiber a day. Sometimes some diets get really kind of extreme in their interpretation. So this, I was like, wow, the whole thing's centered around fiber, and it's pretty right there in terms of where the fiber recommendation needs to be. And then also the diet is released in kind of 3 stages, where step 1, the person is having 35 grams a day of net carbs, including their 35 grams of fiber. Step 2 is 75 grams of these net carbs. Step 3 is 125 grams of these net carbs. And as a reminder, net carbs is total carbs minus fiber grams. So just to go back to that step 1, if someone's doing their 35 grams of fiber a day and they're eating 35 grams of net carbs, their total carb consumption in step 1 is only about 70 grams of carbs. And then that goes up to about 110 and then 100, I think 60 in step 3. And so ultimately, this really starts out as a low carbohydrate diet, moving to a more moderate carbohydrate diet. And they give some recommendations about filling out your plate with, some whole food protein sources and how much fat you can have.
Got it. Okay, so let's do a little pros and cons, a little like and don't like. What do we like about F factor to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing, I mean, focusing on fiber is not a bad thing. It's one of the nutrients that we mentioned. It's not essential, but it's really health promoting. And in my mind, it makes the diet optimal. Even though it's not essential, it will make your diet optimal to have enough fiber in the diet. And like I said just a minute ago, the target isn't that outlandish. It's not, go eat 100 grams of this stuff, which was sort of surprising to me. So I'm like, okay, they're right within the recommended range and they're talking about fiber. This is good. They promote whole foods. That's good. They also address having protein at every meal. That should sound familiar to the audience. They address portion sizes a little bit. So, really, I don't think that this diet at surface value is that wacky. I mean, it's promoting mostly whole unprocessed foods. I also know that a big part of the diet is, hey, we're not going to totally restrict eating out or having any alcohol. So there's a little bit of realism there. So I'm like, okay, like so far so good. I can get on board with those factors.
And remind us, getting in that much fiber or getting in even more fiber is the primarily we do that through whole foods, right? Or is it we can also do that through supplementation and there's a little bit of gray area there? Or like, is that part of why it's so good? Is that the primary way we do get fiber is eat more fruits and vegetables?
It's a great question. You can get all of the fiber that you need from mostly whole unprocessed foods. That's certainly the way that we recommend to do it. Fruits and vegetables are quite variable in how much fiber they have. They can add a lot of fiber to people's diet, but if you end up doing your 800-gram watermelon challenge like you always do, Patrick, you're not going to actually end up with a lot of fiber because there are some items that don't have as much fiber. So, fruits and vegetables aren't the only source. Really, nuts and whole grains are another great source. Of course, beans and lentils and legumes, although I include those in the 800-gram challenge. So, it's going to be fruits and vegetables, but also whole grains and nuts can really get people to that 35 grams quite easily.
Got it. Okay. So, cons then. What should we be looking out for? Maybe why shouldn't we be paying attention to the F factor diet?
Yeah, I'm actually going to first start with kind of following up to your question, can you get fiber from supplements? I think that might be a con of this diet. I know that, as far as I could tell, the F Factor diet does still sell their own kind of products, either bars or shakes and stuff like that. And so I sometimes think that, especially in the way that nutrition gets interpreted in our modern food environment, whether or not the creator intended this or not, is that sometimes people start reaching for the fiber supplements and not the food with fiber in it naturally. And so I even know that there's a popular gummy like candy treat called like smart sweets or something like that, and it's got a ton of fiber in it, and it's just like, okay, if the goal becomes fiber, what are all the ways that we start just using supplements to get there or not. So that would be a drawback. Every diet has loopholes. So, this isn't necessarily a criticism of the creator. I mean, people can game the 800-gram challenge, but just something that comes to mind. I'm thinking, okay, how is this going to go wrong? Well, somebody might be doing 35 grams of fiber on gummy sweets. I think that what really I don't like about the diet, with all the other good things going for it, is how restrictive it is in terms of calories. So those initial 2 weeks, from what I see online, when people kind of run the numbers in terms of calories, and that's what they say, do step 1 for 2 weeks. It ends up being about 1,000 calories. Now, as far as I understand, the creator has this as, quote, a diet jumpstart, which is interesting to me. I know in marketing that it's really good to have early client wins, because that helps reinforce the belief that whatever purchase or program the individual just made was a good one. And so I definitely understand people wanting in diet to see the scale move and to then be motivated to keep going and to have trust in the program and all of that stuff. And so I think this is probably kind of common in diets, that people really push for these early wins. But I'm going to tell you that any weight you lose on the first 2 weeks, especially dropping down to 70 grams of total carbohydrates and doing this super restrictive diet, you're not really instilling habits that are going to last. And B, most of the weight that you've lost is water weight loss from losing muscle glycogen due to the low carbs. And so it just starts to ruffle my feathers a little bit, because I'm like, have we really helped the client win anything here? Right? Like, what's the win here? Now, if the client is super motivated and they continue, great. But I just really have not had success with clients targeting these low calorie diets. In fact, it ends up more of this binge restrict cycle than anything else. And then even when they get to step 2, it's still only about 1,300 calories. And that's still lower than where I've been with, I'd like to say all of my clients, but I don't totally know in some of the master classes exactly what they're hitting. But that's the number I'm like, oh man, we can make progress and not have to be so severe. So I think overall, I love the premise on, hey, let's get enough fiber in. Hey, I love the premise on, let's get enough whole foods in the diet. I think all of that's great. I love the fact that they're not trying to restrict eating out and keep other normal foods in the diet. But when we start to look at the total number of calories that the people are consuming, I actually don't think it's very sustainable. And therefore, it would be like a no-go for me in terms of recommendations.
Last question is, how popular is, you just from your sense of it? I assume it's popular enough that we're talking about it. Usually these conversations happen because somebody's asked you like, hey, have you heard, what do you think about this diet? Is this a wildly popular diet? Is this something that has gotten traction in the world, or is this sort of still relatively new maybe?
I actually think it's sort of older. If my memory serves, I think it's closer to around 2009 that it was developed. And it's the first time that I really heard of it when somebody asked me about it. Now, I'm certainly not the epicenter of knowledge. So there can be a lot of trends that I don't really pick up on. But I hadn't heard of it. But from what I see, there's app, cookbook, different stuff like that, that it's been around for some time for sure.
Take it. All right. Well, thank you very much for that. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening this week. Thank you for your ratings and your reviews. EC and I will be back next week for another episode of the Consistency Project podcast.